Blender 5.0 has introduced an enhancement to a cycle shading function called thin film interference. If you watched my video on this feature when it was introduced in the 4.2 release, I talked about a limitation in the initial implementation which prevented thin film effects from rendering when the principled BSDF was in metallic mode. However, 5.0 now expands the ability of the principled BSDF to render thin film interference on metallic surfaces. This can be incredibly useful for product visualizations that use anodized metals. So you can see I've got this basic material in the principled BSDF, and this also works in the metallic node. So if we came over and just simply took under thin film and we set it to 500 for nanometers and leave the IOR at 1.33, suddenly the metal has thin film effects. And we could change that to, say, have an IOR of 2.5, and you can see how just changing these values gives us different thin film effects. But let's dive in and take a look at some of the nuances here, because there are differences between how you approach metallic surfaces versus other types of surfaces like dielectrics. This is really awesome because some metallic surfaces can exhibit quite strong thin film interference effects caused by the thermal oxidation of the metal. Think of the iridescent colors you see on cooking pots exposed to high heat, or the distinctive coloration, sometimes called bluing, on motorcycle exhaust manifolds. The high heat accelerates the chemical reaction between the metal and oxygen, creating an extremely thin, transparent layer of metal oxide on the surface. These metallic oxide layers are truly microscopic, ranging from tens to hundreds of nanometers in thickness. This tiny scale is critical because these dimensions are comparable to the wavelength of visible light, which is about 380 nanometers to about 740 nanometers. For a more technical rundown, you can watch my first video on thin films, but we'll cover the basics here. When light hits the transparent oxide layer, some of it reflects off the top surface, and some penetrates and then reflects off the actual non-oxidized metal surface underneath. Because the film is so thin at the scale of the light's wavelength, this second reflection is only slightly delayed but very close to the first. Because of their close proximity, these two reflected rays interact. If the peaks and troughs of their wavelengths align, they produce constructive interference, which amplifies the strength of that specific color. If they are out of alignment, they cause destructive interference, which weakens or even cancels that color out. This process results in the final iridescent effect, where certain colors are emphasized and others are removed from the visible spectrum. So let's talk about some of the differences between thin film effects on dielectrics versus metals. Dielectrics can be thought of as electric insulators, whereas metals are conductors. The differences between the two affect how thin films manifest on these two surface categories. So it's important to understand that the value ranges we use to simulate thin film effects on metals are different from those used for dielectrics or nonmetallic surfaces. For instance, a soapy water bubble or a layer of oil on a puddle involves materials that are dielectrics. The index of refraction for these films is relatively low, with water at about 1.33 and common oils or soaps ranging from 1.4 to 1.5. The actual thickness of these films that produce visible interference colors can range in depth, averaging between 200 to 1000 nanometers and sometimes even a bit thicker. These surfaces tend to have slight variations in this thickness across the surface. The combination of these slight thickness variations causes the light to interfere differently, producing the shifting, subtle colors we see in soap bubbles and oil slicks. In contrast, the thin films created by thermal oxidation on metals, like the bluing on an exhaust pipe, have been measured in laboratory experiments and are somewhat different than those used in dielectrics. These different values will produce the vibrant, saturated tinting you see on many metallic surfaces with thin film properties. For instance, the transparent metallic oxide is generally thinner, typically ranging from 25 nanometers to around 300 nanometers. The index of refraction for these metal oxides is much higher, usually falling between 1.6 and 3.0. Using an average IOR value of 2.5 works really well for generally simulating this metallic thin film effect in a shader, or for things like anodized metals, specifically anodized titanium. So let's take a look at this exhaust manifold on this motorcycle engine. And you can see we're in metallic mode, and this is what we couldn't do in versions prior to 5.0. We look at the thickness, it's at 0, so it's turned off, and it's got the default IOR of 1.33, which is appropriate for dielectrics, but on metals it'll just give you a very weak result. So for instance, let's come in here and let's type in 150 nanometers, remembering what I said, that for metals, when you want a really strong vibrant color, you want to keep it below 300 nanometers and typically above 50 nanometers. So let's just type in 150, and you can see when the IOR is 1.33, the result is kind of weak. So let's take this up to 2.5, and then you get a very strong bluing color. Now, if you're saying to yourself, gosh, that looks an awful lot like an anodized metal, you would be correct, because anodized metals actually use a thin film interference process to generate the color you see. In fact, the manufacturing process uses an electrical chemical process to create an oxide layer that produces a specific color for that anodized metal. This will frequently be the case with anodized titanium as an example. So let's do this. Let's say that we want to give this more of a bit of a gradient effect, because when you go online and just do this, go do an image search in your favorite search engine and just do motorcycle exhaust manifold. And some of the images that pop up, you'll definitely see this very strong thin film effect. And in some cases, it's actually kind of a manufacturing process that gives it that for artistic reasons. And sometimes it's that way just because of the use of the exhaust manifold. But let's come over here, and I have already imported a bitmap right here, and I've UV mapped these two end components right here with just a simple projection. And I've got this gradient. So we're going to control this nanometer range across the length of the object. I need to change the bitmap here to non-color. Okay, so let's do this. We can't just drive it in directly. We need to convert the 0 to 1 range of the bitmap into an appropriate range for the nanometers to drive the thickness. So I'm going to come in and search for a map range node. Okay, so it's going to take the values of 0 to 1 and convert that into the range that we want. So let's drive in the bitmap here into value. 0 to 1 is what we want. And let's do this. Let's go from, let's just come over here and look at this again. Let's just play with these values to see kind of what we want. So I'm going to come down here and drag this down, and I'm going to change the color. Maybe I kind of like that really warm color. So let's go from about 125, and then let's go back up to about, I don't know, maybe 170. So 125 to 170 is the range that I want. So let's do 125 to 170 for the nanometer range, and we'll drive that result into thickness. And there we get sort of that gradient that we want. And of course, we could invert that too. So let's come over here and invert that. So the blues tend to be when the when the metal has had the strongest amount of oxidation, from what I understand. So let's specifically talk about anodized metal. I've only sort of briefly mentioned it, but thin film interference is one of the main processes used to create anodized metals using an electrical chemical process. So let's come down here and take a look at this. Let's say that we've got a titanium-based metal right here. We would come in and use sort of the range that I established between, 50 and 300. Let's come in and give it 170 nanometers for the oxide thickness, and then we'll give it 2.5 for the index of refraction, and then you get something that is essentially an anodized metal. So this is one of the great things, is that it will produce a more realistic looking anodized metal than if you had just come up here and changed the base color to a blue that you wanted. It's going to look more realistic. And this is one of the main reasons why having thin film interference on metals is going to be really, really useful. Now, an interesting thing to note here, just sort of as nuances go, the thickness and the index of refraction kind of have an inverse relationship with each other. Changing the IOR can really change the color of the metal. So you see, if I come over here and I change this to 2.8, it really changes the nature of the color. But if we change it back to 2.5 and then I change it specifically, let's say to 2.8, which is a higher index of refraction, but then I lower the thickness to, let's say, 140 nanometers, we go back to a kind of a blue, but there's some nuance in it. But what we're doing is we're saying by lowering the thickness, a stronger index of refraction is increasing the length that the light has to travel, and we end up getting a similar effect than when we had 170 with a 2.5. That's sort of an esoteric thing to understand about how it's working, but just sort of keep that in the back of your mind. You can definitely just go ahead and let's say you're wanting to create anodized titaniums, just use 2.5. Now, other types of metals like anodized aluminum are going to use a little bit lower IOR values, for instance, 1.6 or 1.7. And there's another fascinating metal that's used a lot in manufacturing called niobium, and it uses an oxide layer that typically uses an IOR of 2.3 to 2.4. So just sort of keep those things in the back of your mind. So here I've got these digital clocks, and I've got a metallic surface here for the body of the clock, and I'm just using the standard base color to colorize it. And the colorization is a bit uniform, but let's kind of convert this over into something that would be more of an anodized metal. So in order to do that, we come in and you take the saturation down for the base color and you create a neutral metal. And then when we come down here to the thickness values, again, let me just go ahead and pause the renderer here. Let's come over and set it to 170 nanometers and 2.5, and this would be for, say, like a titanium. And then when we come over, you can see that we get sort of that more blue color. Let's take this down and we can play with sort of the coloration by just shifting that nanometer range a little bit, and you get sort of a more dynamic looking type of metal. That's the beauty of using thin film interference to create these anodized types of metals.